Picture this: a lone traveler, dust clinging to their cloak, stepping onto a road that stretches endlessly toward the horizon. Behind them, the safety of home fades. Ahead, a path riddled with unseen perils. This wasn't just any journey. This was a pilgrimage, a test of faith and endurance that defined the lives of countless medieval men and women. Every mile they walked was a gamble, a dance with danger where bandits could strike without warning. Storms could swallow whole caravans, and illness lurked in every unfamiliar village. Yet they walked on, driven by a devotion so fierce it outweighed the fear. These pilgrims weren't just travelers. They were adventurers in an age where the road itself was a battlefield, and every step brought them closer to either salvation or disaster. What would compel someone to leave everything behind and set off into such uncertainty? The answer lies in the heart of medieval faith, where pilgrimage wasn't just a journey. It was a transformative act, a way to prove one's devotion and seek redemption. The roads to sacred sites like Santiago or Jerusalem were more than dirt and stone. They were threads in a vast tapestry of belief, woven with stories of miracles, sacrifices, and unshakable resolve. But these paths were also shadowed by danger, where the promise of spiritual reward came with very real risks. Pilgrims faced not only the elements, but also the greed of, the politics of warring kingdoms, and the ever-present specter of disease. Their travels were a delicate balance between hope and survival, where every decision could mean the difference between reaching their destination or vanishing into the unknown. Yet within these harrowing tales lies something timeless, a reflection of the human spirit's capacity to endure. The medieval pilgrim's journey wasn't just about reaching a holy site. It was about the transformation that happened along the way. It's a story that echoes through the ages, reminding us that the greatest adventures are often born not from comfort, but from the courage to step into the unknown. So today, we're setting out on our own journey, retracing the footsteps of these determined travelers. Together, we'll uncover the secrets of their roots, the dangers they braved, and the lessons their resilience holds for us today. This is more than history. It's an invitation to walk alongside them, to understand what it truly meant to journey through a world where faith and peril were constant companions. Let's begin. To understand why pilgrimage became such a powerful force in medieval Europe, we have to step into the mindset of the time, a world where heaven and earth felt closer than ever before. For ordinary people, life was often short and harsh, filled with backbreaking labor and constant uncertainty. The idea of embarking on a sacred journey offered something extraordinary, a chance to rewrite one's story, to touch the divine, and perhaps even witness miracles firsthand. But it wasn't just the poor who set out on these roads. Kings and nobles, too, took up the pilgrim's staff, sometimes as acts of penance for their sins, other times to display their piety to the world. Even warriors who had spent their lives fighting saw pilgrimage as a way to cleanse their souls before facing judgment. The Church played a pivotal role in shaping this movement. By declaring that pilgrimage could lessen one's time in purgatory or even erase past sins, clergy turned these journeys into a spiritual necessity for many. Sites like Rome, home to the tombs of Saints Peter, or Canterbury, where Thomas Becket's martyrdom drew thousands, became beacons of hope. Jerusalem, the holiest of all destinations, stood as the ultimate test of devotion, a journey so perilous that simply attempting it was seen as an act of profound faith. Yet pilgrimage wasn't just about duty or fear. For some, It was a rare taste of freedom. Peasants bound to the land their entire lives could, for the first time, step beyond their village borders and see the wider world. Merchants mingled with monks, and storytellers traded tales from distant lands, turning the roads themselves into living, breathing networks of culture and connection. And then there were the miracles, stories that spread like wildfire, drawing even more pilgrims to these sacred sites. A crippled man walking again after praying at a saint's shrine, a blind woman regaining her sight at the touch of holy relics. These accounts weren't just legends. They were proof that the divine could intervene in human lives. For people living in a world where illness and misfortune were constant threats, the chance to witness or even experience such wonders was irresistible. So they came in waves from every corner of Europe, each carrying their own hopes, fears, and prayers. The roads they walked were more than paths to salvation. They were the veins of a continent, pulsing with faith, ambition, and the unshakable belief that somewhere at the end of the journey lay something extraordinary. Of all the roads winding across medieval Europe, 3 stood above the rest, not just in distance, but in the sheer weight of their spiritual significance. First, the Way of St. James, a sprawling network of paths all leading to the Cathedral of Santiago in Spain, where the bones of the apostle were said to rest. Pilgrims from as far as Scandinavia and Hungary braved mountain passes, scorching plains, and the ever-present risk of bandits, all for the chance to kneel before that sacred shrine. Then there was the Via, a serpentine trail stretching from Canterbury to Rome, where travelers faced river crossings that could turn deadly with sudden floods, and mountain paths where a single misstep meant disaster. But neither compared to the peril of the road to Jerusalem, a journey that demanded crossing war-torn territories, navigating hostile ports, and surviving the treacherous waters of the Mediterranean, all while knowing that even if they reached the holy city, returning home was never guaranteed. These routes were far more than just dirt tracks worn by countless footsteps. They became the arteries of an entire continent, pulsing with more than just pilgrims. Merchants hauled silks and spices alongside penitents, their wagons forming makeshift barriers against thieves. Minstrels and storytellers moved from town to town, turning pilgrim hostels into stages where tales of miracles and martyrs spread like wildfire. Even the roads themselves took on sacred meaning. Wayside crosses marked spots where saints had appeared, while bridges built by pious kings became feats of engineering that doubled as acts of devotion. But this constant flow of people also made the routes targets. Lurked in forest shadows, knowing a pilgrim's purse might hold coins saved for years. Local lords imposed arbitrary tolls, squeezing travelers for every penny. And in times of war, these paths became, forcing pilgrims to navigate checkpoints where the wrong accent or allegiance could mean imprisonment, or worse. Yet what's astonishing isn't just the dangers pilgrims faced, but how they prepared for them. Guidebooks from the era read like survival manuals, warning travelers which rivers to ford at dawn, when water levels were lowest, which innkeepers were honest, and which stretches of road required hiring armed guards. Pilgrim badges, tiny lead tokens bought at shrines, served as both spiritual souvenirs and proof of one's journey, offering protection against accusations of vagrancy. And then there were the hidden kindnesses. Monasteries that offered free care to the sick, fishing villages that fed stranded travelers during storms, and fellow pilgrims who shared food, medicine, or simply the comfort of companionship when the road grew dark. The legacy of these routes still echoes today. Walk the Santiago now, and you'll find modern pilgrims retracing those ancient steps, not just for faith, but to connect with something deeper, the same yearning for meaning that drove their medieval counterparts. The roads may be safer now, but the essence remains. A journey that strips away the ordinary, leaving only the raw human need to seek, to struggle, and ultimately to transcend. A pilgrim's journey didn't begin on the road. It began in the quiet moments of preparation, where every item packed could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Imagine standing in your village for the last time, tightening the straps of your leather scrip, knowing it held everything you'd rely on for months. Hard bread, a wedge of cheese, perhaps a few coins sewn into the lining to hide them from thieves. Your staff wasn't just for walking, it was a weapon, a tool to test icy river depths, and a symbol that marked you as a pilgrim, deserving, in theory, of charity and safe passage. But even the most carefully packed bag couldn't account for the unpredictable. A sudden storm could rot your food supply. A snapped sandal strap in the wilderness might force you to walk barefoot for miles. And those letters of recommendation, they were lifelines, but only if the next monastery hadn't closed its doors due to plague or war. Clothing was armor against the elements. Wool cloaks, waxed to repel rain, doubled as blankets under the stars. Broad-brimmed hats shielded faces from sun and snow alike, while a second pair of hose, rolled tightly to save space, could save a traveler from the agony of blisters. But the true test wasn't just enduring discomfort. It was navigating a world where help wasn't guaranteed. Pilgrims memorized the rhythms of the road, where to find fresh water before desert stretches, which towns had hospitals run by the knights, and how to barter with fishermen for passage across treacherous rivers. Some learned the hard way that a shortcut through a lord's forest might end with a demand for a toll they couldn't pay. Yet the most vital preparations weren't tangible. Pilgrims steeled themselves for loneliness, for nights when the howl of wolves would be their only company. They practiced the phrases that might save them, pleas for mercy in a dozen dialects, or the names of saints to invoke if captured. And they carried invisible burdens too, the weight of sins they hoped to leave behind, or the grief of loved ones buried before they could return. These were the things no script could hold, the true cost of a journey where every step was a gamble. Even with meticulous planning, luck played its part. A chance meeting with a merchant caravan could mean safety in numbers, while a wrong turn might lead to a swamp or a bandit's ambush. Some pilgrims traveled with relics sewn into their clothes, bone fragments of saints or vials of holy water, believing these could ward off disaster. Others relied on cunning, like the woman who disguised herself as a beggar to avoid notice, or the group who pretended to be merchants, their pilgrim badges hidden until they reached sanctuary. The road demanded more than faith, it demanded resilience. Those who returned bore scars, not just from blisters or battles, but from the knowledge that survival often hinged on choices made in moments of desperation. Their stories whispered a hard truth. No amount of preparation could conquer the unknown. It could only arm them for the fight. Bandits didn't just lurk in the shadows. They became masters of deception, turning the very symbols of pilgrimage against the faithful. That ragged figure begging by the roadside. He might be a scout, signaling hidden accomplices when a vulnerable traveler passed. The friendly monk offering to share a fire. His robes could be stolen, his prayers a rehearsed script to lower defenses. Even the most cautious pilgrims fell victim, like the merchant from who woke to find his pious companions gone, along with his money, boots, and the silver cross meant as an offering. Thrived where geography favored ambush. Dense forests like Germany's Black Wood or the wild hills of northern Spain became infamous choke points, where arrows could fly from treetops before victims drew breath. River fords were equally treacherous. Water masked the sound of approaching footsteps, and struggling through currents left pilgrims too exhausted to fight back. Some robbers even exploited local superstitions, dressing as ghostly figures to frighten travelers into dropping their belongings and fleeing. But the boldest thieves operated in plain sight. At crowded markets near shrines, pickpockets brushed against pilgrims mid-prayer, their fingers swift as they lifted purses. Dishonest innkeepers watered down ale while their partners rifled through guests' packs upstairs. And then there were the toll collectors, some legitimate, others self-appointed, who demanded impossible sums at makeshift bridges or mountain passes, threatening violence if refused. The line between bandit and beggar often blurred. Desperate peasants, pushed to starvation by poor harvests or lordly taxes, sometimes saw pilgrims as their only hope for survival. A few coins taken at knife point might feed a family for weeks. This didn't justify the violence, but it added a grim complexity to the encounters. Pilgrims robbed by men just one bad season away from needing alms themselves. Defensive strategies became as varied as the threats. Wealthier travelers hired mercenaries, their swords glinting warnings to would-be attackers. Others carried fake purses, a decoy filled with pebbles to toss, while keeping real valuables hidden in hems or hollowed-out staffs. Groups developed coded whistles to alert each other to danger, and some even traveled with attack dogs trained to snatch knives from assailants' hands. Yet the greatest protection often came from unexpected quarters. Local villagers, though poor, sometimes sheltered pilgrims from known bandit bands, hiding them in root cellars or haylofts. A few outlaws, moved by tales of sacred journeys, returned stolen relics, though never the money. And in rare, miraculous accounts, pilgrims spoke of being spared by thieves who crossed themselves mid-robbery, whispering, "Go, your faith is armor I cannot pierce." These encounters left scars deeper than lost coins. Trust became a luxury few could afford. Pilgrims learned to sleep in shifts, to distrust sudden kindness, to measure every smile for hidden teeth. The road didn't just test their devotion, it taught them to see darkness in daylight and to find fleeting grace in the places. Mountains didn't just test a pilgrim's stamina, they toyed with their very survival. Take the Pyrenees, that jagged spine separating France from Spain. Summer travelers faced scorching sun that baked the rocks into furnaces, while those who dared the passes in autumn risked sudden storms that turned narrow trails into icy death traps. Legends spoke of entire parties vanishing under avalanches, their bodies found centuries later by shepherds, their pilgrim badges still gleaming faintly under the snow. And then there were the winds, howling gales that could pluck a man off a ledge like a leaf, leaving nothing behind but a fading scream. Crossing rivers was no less treacherous. What looked like a shallow ford at dawn could become a raging torrent by noon, swollen with distant rain. Pilgrims often linked arms, forming human chains to brave the current, but one misstep could drag the entire group under. Bridges were rare and often crumbling, some so narrow that travelers had to crawl across on hands and knees, pressing against the stone while the river roared below. In spring, when snowmelt turned every stream into a monster, pilgrims faced impossible choices. Wait for weeks, spending precious coins on food and lodging, or trust their lives to a rickety ferry operated by a grinning local who might charge a month's wages for 5 minutes of crossing. Storms transformed the landscape into a shifting nightmare. A sunny morning in the Alps could give way to a blizzard by noon, obscuring trails and leaving pilgrims stumbling blindly through waist-deep snow. Lightning strikes ignited trees, sending pilgrims fleeing from flaming branches. Even fog became a predator. Swirling mists in mountain valleys disoriented travelers, leading them in circles until exhaustion or exposure claimed them. Survivors told of hearing voices in the wind, ghostly whispers that some believed were demons trying to lure them off the path. Yet nature's cruelty was matched only by the ingenuity it forced from its victims. Pilgrims learned to read the sky like sailors, watching cloud formations for hints of coming storms. They carried rags soaked in fat to wrap around torches, creating makeshift flares that could burn even in downpours. Some strapped hollowed-out gourds to their belts, lightweight flotation devices if swept away by rivers. And then there were the unspoken rules of the road. Never camp in a dry riverbed. Always fill your water skin at the last clear stream before a climb. And if you find a corpse on the trail, bury it quickly, both for piety's sake and because the scent of death drew wolves. Local guides were both lifelines and gambles. A shepherd from the Pyrenees might know every hidden spring and sheltered cave, but he'd also demand payment in silver or the wool cloak off your back. Some led pilgrims deliberately astray, abandoning them in dead-end canyons to steal their supplies. Others, though, became unexpected guardians. There's a story of a Basque guide who carried an injured pilgrim on his shoulders for 3 days through a storm, refusing all payment at the end, saying only, "Today you, tomorrow me." The land itself became a character in these journeys, sometimes a foe, sometimes a grudging ally. Pilgrims who survived the mountains spoke of them with a mix of terror and awe, as if they'd wrestled with something ancient and half alive. Rivers were baptized with names like the Swallower or Saint's Mercy, marking where miracles or tragedies had unfolded. Even the storms took on mythic weight, with hail the size of walnuts said to be the devil's own dice, and rainbows arching over passes hailed as bridges built by angels. What's striking isn't just that pilgrims faced these horrors, but how they transformed them. A boulder where a traveler froze to death might become a shrine, its cracks stuffed with handwritten prayers. A river that drowned a dozen souls could be renamed the Jordan, turning danger into holy metaphor. Every scar the land left on them, they repaid with stories, tales that turned terror into testament, and made even the mile a verse in their song of survival. Disease stalked the pilgrim roads like an invisible thief, stealing lives with a ruthlessness no bandit could match. Imagine choking on the stench of a roadside hostel where 50 travelers shared a single room, their bodies pressed onto flea-infested straw. Water from village wells, cloudy with runoff from graveyards upstream, carried dysentery that could kill a strong man in 3 days. Even the act of charity became deadly. When a kind soul offered bread to a feverish traveler, They might unknowingly pass along the plague festering in that pilgrim's sweat-soaked clothes. For every robber's knife avoided, there were 100 tiny assassins. Contaminated food, mosquito bites, the cough of a stranger in the next bed. Yet what's chilling isn't just how easily death came, but how quietly it was accepted. Pilgrim diaries speak of burying companions at dawn and walking on by noon, their grief swallowed by the greater mission. Some saw disease as divine testing. A fever that broke might signal God's favor, while one that lingered could mean unfinished penance. At the hospital of St. Inn, monks treated holy fire, a gangrenous condition caused by poisoned grain, by amputating fingers blackened like charred wood. Survivors wore their scars as badges of endurance, proof they'd wrestled with angels and won. The wealthy tried to buy protection. Silk veils filtered dust from plague-ridden air, while silver spoons, believed to detect poison, tested every meal. But the poor relied on folk wisdom, chewing garlic to ward off miasmas, or hanging pouches of mercury around their necks, unaware the cure was deadlier than the disease. Worst of all were the quarantine sheds outside city walls, where suspected plague carriers languished without food or water until they proved their health, or didn't. Many pilgrims spent their last days staring at a distant cathedral spire through barred windows, close enough to touch their salvation, yet forever out of reach. Ironically, the very sites meant to heal became hotspots of contagion. At Canterbury, pilgrims queued to touch Becket's tomb with lips already ulcerated from sickness. In Rome, the crush of bodies around St. Peter's relics during Jubilee years spread sweating sickness like wildfire. Yet faith twisted even this into a perverse comfort. Dying near a shrine might grant swifter passage to heaven. Some travelers carried shrouds in their packs, sewing their names into the fabric so their corpses could be identified if they fell to the pilgrim's friend, as dysentery was grimly nicknamed. The echoes of this suffering linger in unexpected places. Modern archaeologists find mass graves along medieval routes, the skeletons still clutching rusted pilgrim badges in bony fingers. Chemical analysis of their teeth reveals origins hundreds of miles away, proof they walked unimaginable distances only to perish steps from their goal. Their silent bones tell a truth the chronicles often omit. For every pilgrim who returned with tales of miracles, there were countless others who became the road itself, their bodies dissolving into the earth beneath future travelers' feet. This ever-present shadow of death didn't diminish the pilgrimages, it them. To fall ill was to share in Christ's suffering. To recover was resurrection. And to die en route, that was the ultimate act of devotion, a life surrendered on the threshold of grace. The roads weren't just pathways to holiness. They were altars where ordinary men and women offered their very bodies as sacrifices, trusting that somewhere beyond the pain, beyond the fear, lay a mercy greater than any plague. Monasteries rose from the landscape like fortresses of mercy, their gates standing open when every other door might slam shut. Imagine stumbling upon one at dusk, smoke curling from its kitchens, the sound of vespers drifting over walls that promised safety for the night. Inside, the rule of saint demanded that all travelers be received as Christ himself, a command taken so seriously that some houses kept beds perpetually ready, the straw fresh even in winter when few dared the roads. At monks washed pilgrims' feet in stone basins, while others prepared thick lentil stew, knowing these starved wayfarers couldn't digest rich meat after weeks of scant rations. But hospitality wasn't just kindness, it was currency. Donations from grateful pilgrims funded cathedral construction, while the prayers of the poor were believed to carry special weight in heaven. Hospices took this further, transforming care into sacred art. The knights ran infirmaries where brothers trained in Arabic medicine, learned from Muslim doctors during the Crusades, stitched wounds with silk soaked in wine to prevent infection. At the Great St. Bernard Pass, monks led massive shaggy dogs into blizzards to find travelers buried in snow, the animals' barrels of brandy clinking against their collars. Yet even these refuges had dark edges. Overcrowding turned dormitories into breeding grounds for disease, and not all healers were gentle. At pilgrims with rotting limbs sometimes awoke to find them amputated without consent, the monks believing the soul mattered more than the body. The line between sanctuary and trap was perilously thin. Isolated monasteries became targets for bandits who knew pilgrims carried valuables. Some abbots demanded excessive donations, turning away those who couldn't pay, a violation of canon law that prompted tales of divine vengeance, like the abbot who dropped dead after refusing a dying woman. Worse were the counterfeit hospices, run by thieves who drugged visitors' ale to rob them unconscious. Yet for every abuse, there were 100 acts of quiet heroism. In the Alps, monks hung iron crosses where avalanches had claimed lives, each bearing the same inscription: "Pray for those who rest here, and for those who tried to save them." At nuns kept an eternal flame burning so lost pilgrims could navigate through fog, while the hospice at maintained a nightly horn-blowing ritual, 3 long notes to guide stragglers home. These weren't just services, they were living sermons, proof that mercy could flourish even in the harshest landscapes. What's astonishing isn't that some exploited the system, but how many upheld it against impossible odds. When the Black Death emptied whole monasteries, survivors still dragged bodies away to keep the gates open. When wars cut off supplies, monks starved so pilgrims could eat. Their legacy lingers in modern hospitality. The word hostel comes from their medieval term for these of grace. To stay in one was to witness a paradox. Places that smelled of sweat and sickness, yet glowed with a conviction that every ragged traveler carried something holy within them. The Pilgrim's Road was never just a path. It was a chessboard where kings, bishops, and local lords made their moves. Every bridge, every mountain pass became a piece in a game of control, with pilgrims caught as unwilling pawns. Take the Alpine routes, where feudal barons perched like spiders in their cliffside castles, lowering chains across roads to demand payment. Refuse, and you might find yourself locked in a dungeon until your family ransomed you with coins they couldn't afford. Even holy men played the game. Bishops in southern France charged merchants and pilgrims alike for safe passage through lands they claimed by divine right, their tax collectors armed with ledger books and crossbows. War turned these tensions deadly. During the 100 Years' War, English and French forces deliberately targeted pilgrimage routes, knowing the disruption would weaken morale. Pilgrims bound for Santiago recounted being stopped at makeshift border checks, forced to swear allegiance to whichever kings, soldiers held the valley that week. Some carried multiple letters of safe conduct, secretly tucked beneath their tunics, switching them out depending on the flag flying over the next garrison. the luckless ones who chose wrong-faced confiscation, imprisonment, or conscription into armies they'd never heard of. Yet the greatest predators often wore crowns. Kings like Philip IV of France manipulated pilgrimage traffic to bankrupt rivals, suddenly closing borders to divert trade through their own territories. In Germany, robber knights, technically nobles, though indistinguishable from bandits, built illegal toll towers along the Rhine, extracting river taxes from boatloads of pilgrims until the emperor sent troops to burn their strongholds. Even the church, ostensibly the protector of pilgrims, couldn't resist the lure of profit. At certain shrines, priests demanded fees to unlock the reliquary cases, turning moments of devotion into transactions. Pilgrims developed survival tactics as nuanced as the threats they faced. Wealthy travelers hired local guides not just for navigation, but for their knowledge of which lord's mistress could be bribed with silk from Florence, or which abbey's wine cellar was worth a donation to secure swift passage. Pilgrims learned to travel in large, disorderly groups, harder to tax in, or disguised themselves as lepers, their hoods and clattering bells making even greedy soldiers keep their distance. Some carried fake relics, knowing a show of sacred bones might intimidate petty officials into backing down. The politics of the road left scars on the landscape itself. In Spain, the Order of Santiago built fortified hostels at strategic intervals, their night monks patrolling against both bandits and overzealous tax collectors. In Italy, rival city-states competed to maintain road sections, calculating that smoother paths would draw pilgrims and their spending away from neighboring towns. Even the humble pilgrim badge became political. Wearing one from a powerful shrine like Canterbury could deter harassment, as attacking its bearers risked drawing the archbishop's wrath. What's revealing isn't just the cruelty pilgrims faced, but how they turned the system against itself. A clever traveler might whisper to a toll collector that the group behind him carried more silver, buying his own passage with deception. Others exploited feudal rivalries. Mentioning an enemy lord's name could sometimes get you waved through, just to spite him. And in rare moments, the oppressed fought back. Records in Burgundy tell of pilgrims pelting a tyrannical tax officer with stones until he fled into the woods, his ledger sinking into the mud behind him. These weren't just journeys of faith, they were in navigating power. Every decision carried weight, trusting the wrong guide, wearing the wrong badge, or even laughing at the wrong joke in a lord's hall could upend a pilgrimage. Yet through it all, the roads kept calling. Because beneath the greed and the grinding wheels of politics, pilgrims still believed something waited at the end worth every peril, every injustice, a truth no toll could ever tax. The greatest battles on the pilgrim roads weren't fought with swords or staffs. They raged silently within the hearts of those who walked them. Imagine waking before dawn for the 100th straight morning, your body screaming from blisters, your stomach hollow with hunger, and whispering into the darkness, "Why am I doing this?" That moment of doubt was more dangerous than any bandit's blade, because it threatened the very foundation of their journey. The isolation could be crushing. Pilgrims from crowded cities found the endless emptiness of open roads unnerving. No familiar faces, just the relentless rhythm of their own footsteps echoing like a taunt. Some began talking to their shadows, or to saints they hoped were listening. Others kept diaries, scrawling prayers in margins when the loneliness became unbearable. Yet it wasn't just solitude that gnawed at their resolve. Every setback, a stolen purse, a fever, a washed-out bridge, felt like divine punishment. "Had God abandoned me?" wrote one pilgrim after losing his way in the Apennines, his ink smudged with rain or maybe tears. The wealthy suffered unexpected humiliations, too. A knight accustomed to servants might find himself begging for crusts at a peasant's door, his title meaningless in the face of need. These weren't just inconveniences. They were spiritual earthquakes, shaking the foundations of identity and faith. Paradoxically, this unraveling often became the pilgrimage's true purpose. Stripped of status, comfort, even basic dignity, travelers confronted themselves. A merchant who'd spent his life haggling might weep at the generosity of a shepherd who shared his last loaf. A noblewoman used to giving orders learned to accept help from strangers without pride. The road didn't just lead to shrines, it led to humility, a quality no cathedral could bestow, but every true pilgrim had to earn. Some couldn't bear the transformation. Records tell of pilgrims abandoning their vows halfway, sneaking onto merchant ships bound for home, unable to face the shame of quitting, but equally unable to continue. Others channeled their anguish into wild acts of devotion, walking barefoot over flinty paths, or wearing hair shirts that drew blood with every step. Their suffering wasn't madness, it was bargaining, an attempt to trade physical pain for spiritual clarity. But for those who persevered, the trials forged an unshakable resilience. The same nun who nearly turned back at the Loire's swollen banks would later laugh as she recounted the story, marveling at how fear had blinded her to the ferry just around the bend. The doubting merchant's journal entries shift over months from despair to a quiet wonder, not because his hardships lessened, but because he'd grown stronger than them. This alchemy of suffering into strength wasn't automatic. It required what medieval mystics called the dark night of the soul, those moments when all seemed lost, when prayers echoed unanswered, and yet the pilgrim took one more step, then another. The miracles they sought weren't just in the shrines ahead, but in the ordinary courage of continuing when every instinct screamed to stop. Perhaps that's why so many who completed their journeys described feeling lighter upon return, not just from lost belongings, but from shed illusions. The road had whittled them down to their essence, leaving only what truly mattered. They learned a truth no sermon could teach. That faith isn't the absence of doubt, but the choice to walk through it. Pilgrim badges gleamed like tiny shields of honor, sewn onto cloaks and hats with threads worn thin from miles of travel. These small lead or pewter tokens, molded with images of saints, scallop shells, or sacred scenes, weren't just decorations. They were proof, stamped with the authority of distant shrines, that the wearer had braved the impossible. A badge from Santiago might show Saint James with his pilgrim staff, while one from Rome bore the crossed keys of Saint Peter. To display them was to announce, without speaking a word, that you had walked through fire and come out. But these emblems carried more than spiritual weight. They were medieval status symbols, transforming a peasant who'd knelt at Canterbury into someone worthy of respect, even awe, in their village square. Yet for every genuine badge, there were a dozen fakes. Unscrupulous vendors near popular shrines peddled cheap imitations to travelers too exhausted or gullible to question their authenticity. Some counterfeiters grew bold, setting up stalls just outside cathedral gates, selling badges they'd never been authorized to produce. The worst even dipped them in holy water to mimic the sheen of blessed metal. Pilgrims who later discovered the deception faced a bitter choice: wear the lie and risk divine displeasure, or discard it and lose the social capital they'd paid for in blisters and hunger. Relics were even more fraught. A vial of dust from Saint's tomb might actually be roadside dirt, while a splinter of the true cross could be slivers of ordinary oak. The trade in fraudulent relics became so rampant that satirists joked Jerusalem's cross must have been the size of a ship to account for all the fragments circulating Europe. But the humor masked real anguish. What if the relic you'd risked your life to touch was a sham? What if the miracles you prayed for went unanswered not because God willed it, but because some huckster's deception had broken the sacred contract between pilgrim and divine? The church fought back with elaborate authentication systems. Seals pressed into molten lead badges, signed certificates from bishops, even relic inventories read aloud to pilgrims to prove their provenance. Yet human ingenuity for deceit kept pace. In Lincoln, authorities caught a man selling badges he'd stamped using a stolen mold, while in Venice, a merchant was whipped through the streets for hawking Mary's tears bottled from the Adriatic. The very measures meant to ensure trust sometimes backfired. When a shrine's badge became too hard to counterfeit, thieves simply robbed returning pilgrims for theirs. What's fascinating isn't just the scams, but why they mattered so deeply. These objects weren't mere trinkets, they were physical embodiments of transformation. To lose a badge was to lose part of the self you'd become on the road. Some pilgrims, discovering fakes, walked back hundreds of miles to obtain the real thing, unable to bear the thought of their suffering being uncredited in heaven's ledger. Others, more pragmatic, sewed both genuine and counterfeit badges together, as if quantity might compensate for doubt. The badges that survived, dug up in fields, found tucked into medieval walls, tell silent stories of pride and anxiety. Some are polished smooth from years of anxious rubbing between fingers, their saints' faces worn featureless. Others remain crisp, perhaps abandoned when their owners realize the truth. Together, they whisper a paradox, that even in an age of profound faith, people still longed for something tangible to hold onto, proof, not just for God, but for themselves and the world, that their journey had been real. The Pilgrim's Road, for all its sacred purpose, teemed with wolves in woolen garb, those who saw devotion as nothing more than a purse to pick. Among the most brazen were the relic peddlers, their carts clattering with authentic fragments of saints' bones, each wrapped in velvet and accompanied by a story too miraculous to verify. In busy market squares near shrines, these charlatans performed like actors, dropping to their knees at the sight of a wealthy traveler, clutching their chests as if struck by divine revelation. "This very sliver," they'd whisper, "came from the true cross itself. See how it glows when held by the pure of heart." The glow, of course, came from a hidden smear of phosphorescent fungus. More sinister still were the false healers. At where pilgrims gathered to venerate Mary Magdalene's relics, a man known as Brother would plant accomplices among the sick actors who'd writhe on the ground, then leap up cured, after he touched them with a blessed feather. Desperate pilgrims would empty their savings for a touch of that same feather, only to find their lameness or blindness stubbornly unchanged. By the time they realized the ruse had vanished, his next performance already scheduled at a shrine 3 towns over. Even the dying weren't spared. In Canterbury, a gang posed as priests, offering last rites to ailing pilgrims, then discreetly rifled through their belongings as they pretended to anoint them with holy oil. Theft wasn't always so covert. Some fraudsters turned pilgrimage routes into elaborate traps. Near Saint, travelers reported a miraculous spring that appeared only to lost pilgrims at dusk, a pond whose waters supposedly healed blistered feet. Those who knelt to drink would find themselves surrounded by fellow pilgrims, offering to hold their staffs and scrips, only to wake hours later, stripped of everything. The spring revealed as a muddy depression filled by the morning tide. Others fell victim to counterfeit toll collectors, men who set up makeshift booths at river crossings with forged seals and documents demanding payment. Refuse, and they'd produce a knife. Pay, and you'd meet the real toll collector a mile downstream. Yet the most insidious scams preyed on hope itself. A woman known as sold Pilgrim prophecies, claiming the Virgin Mary spoke to her in dreams. For a fee, she'd reveal whether a traveler's loved ones had entered heaven, a cruel con that left families burdened with guilt if they couldn't afford her escalating prices for additional intercessions. Another fraud involved forged letters from home, sold to lonely pilgrims after months on the road. These fake missives, often filled with false news of births or deaths, were designed to provoke hurried returns and another round of tolls for the conspirators along the homeward route. Pilgrims developed defenses as cunning as the threats they faced. Guidebooks listed known fraudsters by name and description, warning travelers to avoid the one-eyed relic seller of Tours or the red-haired innkeeper who waters his wine. Some carried small scales to weigh relics. True fragments of St. Peter's chains, for instance, were said to grow heavier when placed on them. Others tested healing springs by dipping iron nails into the water. If the nail rusted, the miracle was likely tainted. Wealthy travelers hired notaries to verify relics' authenticity, while the poor relied on gut instinct. If a seller seemed too eager, his wares probably were too. The church fought back with its own weapons. Bishops issued sealed certificates for legitimate relics, while shrines began stamping badges with distinctive marks that couldn't be easily. Some monasteries kept fraud books, where pilgrims could report scams, their pages filled with sketches of wanted men and warnings about new tricks. Canons even staged public demonstrations, exposing fake relics with vinegar, which would bubble on contact with certain counterfeits, or holding them near flames to prove they didn't melt like common lead. What's revealing isn't just the prevalence of these deceptions, but how they shaped the nature of faith itself. Pilgrims learned to balance trust with skepticism, to seek the divine without surrendering their wits. The road became a school of discernment, where every outstretched hand might offer grace or greed, and telling the difference was part of the journey. In an age without banks or police, their vigilance wrote an unspoken code. That true holiness never demands blind credulity, only a heart open enough to hope and wise enough to question. Women walked the pilgrim roads with a quiet defiance that turned every mile into a rebellion. While men could set out with little more than a blessing, women needed permission, from husbands, fathers, or local priests, just to step onto the path. Some widows, like the famous Marjorie, traded their mourning veils for pilgrim cloaks, transforming grief into purpose. Others, like the anonymous German nun, whose diary survives in fragments, slipped away at dawn, leaving notes pinned to chapel doors explaining their sacred disobedience. Their journeys were acts of courage layered upon courage, for the threats they faced went far beyond rough roads and bad weather. A woman traveling alone was assumed to be either a saint or a sinner, with most strangers guessing the latter. Inns often refused them lodging, forcing many to sleep in church porches or haylofts, where even the kindness of farmers came with wary glances. Saw female pilgrims as easy prey, knowing society would blame the victim. Why was she on the road at all? Whispered behind closed doors. Some women carried daggers hidden in their sleeves, while others traveled with dogs trained to attack at a certain command. The most resourceful disguised themselves as men, binding their chests and deepening their voices, though discovery could bring worse dangers than the road itself. Yet what's astonishing isn't just what women endured, but what they achieved. Marjorie's autobiography, the first known English-language memoir written by a woman, bursts with raw honesty. She describes weeping uncontrollably at holy sites, not from weakness, but from a faith so intense it shattered decorum. Her fellow pilgrims mocked these outbursts, but Marjorie refused to quiet herself, turning each sob into a challenge to those who thought piety had a gender. Other women left subtler marks. The unnamed Breton pilgrim, who carved her initials into the stones of Monte's cave shrine, or the Italian noblewoman who funded a hospice after surviving an avalanche in the Alps, ensuring others wouldn't face the cold as she had. The church's ambivalence toward female pilgrims deepened the risks. While abbesses like have championed spiritual journeys for women, many priests warned that the road would unsex them, as if devotion had a single acceptable form. Some shrines even barred women entirely, forcing them to wait outside while male companions venerated relics within. Yet women found ways to claim their space. At Saint's Abbey Inn, the tomb of a child martyr became a gathering point for mothers who'd lost children, their prayers weaving a silent sisterhood across language barriers. In Santiago, female pilgrims sewed scallop shells, the symbol of into their veils, transforming modest attire into bold declarations of endurance. Their legacy lingers in unexpected places. Modern archaeologists find women's artifacts along medieval routes, a rusted hairpin near a mountain pass, a child's shoe preserved in the mud of a riverbank, hinting at stories untold. Some were likely fleeing abusive marriages under the guise of pilgrimage, their vows offering legal protection from pursuers. Others sought escape from the grinding monotony of spinning wheels and childbearing, trading domestic servitude for a horizon that promised, if nothing else, change. What makes their journeys so compelling isn't just the obstacles they overcame, but the truths they uncovered along the way. Marjorie wrote of kissing lepers' wounds and feeling not revulsion, but a strange joy. The German nun's diary speaks of nights spent singing with strangers under the stars, her voice one among many, unbound by convent walls. These weren't just pilgrimages, they were awakenings, proof that the road could be both crucible and cradle, breaking old selves to birth new ones. And in a world determined to silence them, every footstep was a declaration. That devotion has no gender, and heaven's gates swing wide for all who dare the journey. The dusty roads walked by medieval pilgrims didn't just lead to shrines. They wound their way into the very heart of art and literature, transforming raw experience into something timeless. Take the Canterbury Tales, where a colorful cast of travelers, the bawdy wife of Bath, the corrupt pardoner, the noble knight, mirrored the real-life collisions of class and character that happened every day on pilgrimage routes. But this wasn't just storytelling. It was social commentary wrapped in satire, a sly reveal that sacred journeys didn't magically erase human flaws. Even the most devout pilgrim might grumble about blisters or haggle over a bed for the night, and its genius was capturing that unvarnished truth. His tales became a mirror held up to medieval society, reflecting both its piety and its hypocrisy, all while entertaining audiences with raucous humor that still lands centuries later. Artists, too, found inspiration in the pilgrim's journey. Illuminated manuscripts glowed with scenes of travelers kneeling before reliquaries, their faces etched with exhaustion and awe. These weren't generic saints. They were portraits of real people, their cheeks and tattered cloaks painted with such detail you could almost hear their weary sighs. In stained glass windows, sunlight streamed through images of pilgrims crossing mountains, turning their struggles into kaleidoscopes of devotion. Even the humble pilgrim badge became art. Craftsmen molded lead into intricate scenes of saints and shrines, wearable proof of a journey's completion. But these tokens served a darker purpose too. Guides like the Codex warned future pilgrims to watch for counterfeit badges, proving that art wasn't just celebration, it was survival advice in disguise. Literature didn't just depict pilgrimage, it guided it. Handwritten guidebooks blended practical tips with legends, advising travelers which saints, shrines could cure blindness, or which mountain springs were safe to drink. A 12th century guide to Santiago read like a medieval Lonely Planet, complete with warnings about unscrupulous innkeepers and rivers that swallow men whole. These books often blurred the line between fact and miracle. One described a field where the grass grew backward to point pilgrims toward Santiago, while another claimed a single prayer at a certain cross could shave 40 days off purgatory. Whether literal or symbolic, these stories armed travelers with hope as much as knowledge, turning fear into folklore. The pilgrims' influence even reshaped architecture. Churches along major routes competed to outshine each other with towering spires and radiant stained glass, knowing awestruck visitors would leave donations. Sculptors carved tympanums depicting Judgment Day over cathedral doors, a not-so-subtle reminder to pilgrims to repent before entering. Some shrines became immersive art installations. The skeleton of Saint was dressed in gold and jewels, her hollow eye sockets staring down at pilgrims as if weighing their souls. This wasn't decoration, it was psychological theater, designed to humble and exhilarate in equal measure. What's remarkable isn't just how pilgrimage inspired art, but how art, in turn, shaped pilgrimage. Songs composed by wandering minstrels turned local saints into celebrities, drawing crowds to previously obscure shrines. Paintings of miracles, like the Virgin Mary rescuing a pilgrim from bandits, became self-fulfilling prophecies, encouraging more travelers to risk the roads. Even graffiti left on chapel walls by passing pilgrims added to the collective tapestry, their scratched names and prayers forming a chorus of voices across generations. These creations did more than document history. They transformed the act of pilgrimage itself into a living artwork. Every traveler who set out with words ringing in their ears, or who traced their fingers over an illuminated manuscript's painted roads, was stepping into a story far grander than themselves. The road wasn't just a path anymore. It was a canvas, and every pilgrim, knowingly or not, became part of the brushstroke. For the thief who stole a loaf of bread to feed his family, or the knight who spilled blood in a tavern brawl, the pilgrim's staff might be thrust into their hands not by choice, but by decree. These were the penitential pilgrims, men and women sentenced to walk hundreds of miles not for spiritual fulfillment, but as punishment. A judge's verdict could transform the road to Santiago into an open-air prison, where every step was measured not in miles, but in atonement. Some carried iron collars riveted around their necks, the weight a constant reminder of their crimes. Others dragged heavy chains wrapped around their waists, the metal links clanking like a morbid metronome counting down their redemption. But what happened when pilgrimage ceased to be a calling and became a sentence? Did the road still hold its transformative power, or did it breed only resentment? The law's logic was straightforward. Exile a criminal temporarily, forcing them to reflect on their sins while contributing something holy to society. In England, murderers might be ordered to carry crosses from there to holy sites abroad, their hands stained not with blood, but with the blisters of penance. In France, thieves walked with their stolen goods strapped to their backs, not to return them, but to let the items rot slowly under sun and rain as they trudged toward shrines. The spectacle was intentional. Villagers lining the roads would point and whisper, reinforcing the shame. Yet this public humiliation came with an odd mercy. Completing the pilgrimage meant wiping the slate clean. A sentenced pilgrim who returned with proof, a badge, a sealed letter from a shrine's priest, could no longer be prosecuted for their crime. But the heart rarely bends to legal decrees. Records from medieval courts reveal starkly different outcomes. Some penitents, like the Flemish weaver caught forging coins, returned genuinely changed. His journal describes weeping at the tomb of Saint James, realizing his greed had nearly cost his soul. Others treated their sentences as inconveniences. Wealthy offenders hired substitutes to walk for them, a practice so common that some shrines began requiring pilgrims to recite personal details about their crimes to prove their identity. The most cynical turned their punishments into opportunities. A group of bandits sentenced to pilgrimage in Italy simply robbed fellow travelers along the way, using their official papers to avoid suspicion, until a sharp-eyed monk noticed their boots were too fine for genuine penitents. The church wrestled with this contradiction. Was forced pilgrimage a perversion of sacred tradition, or a shrewd way to channel society's outcasts toward grace? Monks debated whether to deny these pilgrims shelter, fearing their presence endangered the devout. Yet some of history's most striking conversions emerged from these very sentences. Take the case of a Welsh noblewoman ordered to Canterbury after poisoning her husband. She arrived shackled and snarling, but the journey stripped her defenses mile by mile. By the time she touched Becket's tomb, she refused to leave, spending her remaining years washing the feet of other pilgrims as a servant in the abbey. What's haunting isn't the system's flaws, but its occasional, startling successes. The road, even when imposed as punishment, retained an uncanny ability to break through the hardest hearts. Perhaps it was the rhythm of footsteps wearing down resistance, or the way shrines, designed to overwhelm the senses with incense, chanting, and gold, could crack open even grudging visitors. Or maybe, just maybe, the very act of walking long enough made the difference between rebellion and surrender. Because when you've dragged chains across 500 miles of mud and rock, there comes a moment when the weight feels different, not like punishment anymore, but like a key you've carried all along, finally fitting a lock you didn't know existed. The roads to Santiago, Rome, and Jerusalem didn't just carry pilgrims. They funneled silver, silk, and spices into the towns lucky enough to lie along their paths. Picture a sleepy village transformed almost overnight into a bustling. Its muddy square now crammed with merchants hawking everything from lead pilgrim badges to hot pies that steamed in the morning air. Blacksmiths hammered out fresh horseshoes for wealthy travelers' mounts, while local women sold woven baskets to hold the relics pilgrims would collect. Even the humblest farmhouse might hang a sign offering clean straw for honorable guests, turning spare barn space into a lucrative side business. But this economic windfall wasn't evenly shared. Towns just a mile off the main route withered as traffic passed them by, their wells drying up from neglect, while rival villages dug new ones to meet pilgrim demand. Geography became destiny, and the scramble to attract travelers sparked fierce competition, sometimes literally. In Burgundy, two towns nearly came to blows over the right to host a fragment of the true cross, knowing the relic would guarantee a steady stream of visitors for generations. The real power players weren't the pilgrims themselves, but those who controlled the infrastructure. Monastic orders like the Knights built sprawling complexes that functioned as spiritual Walmarts, offering beds, meals, medical care, and souvenir badges under one roof, all for a suggested donation that somehow always matched the thickness of a traveler's purse. Crafty bishops imposed tolls on bridges they'd blessed, while local lords demanded fees for protecting roads their own ancestors had neglected for centuries. The most brazen schemes blurred the line between commerce and extortion. At the Alpine Pass of, travelers reported being charged by the inch for snowshoes during winter crossings, with officials using marked poles to measure pilgrims' feet and inflate prices. Meanwhile, in the shadow of Canterbury Cathedral, unscrupulous tavern keepers watered down ale and hired pickpockets to linger near drunk pilgrims, ensuring every penny spent in town eventually circled back into the same few pockets. Yet for all its corruption, the pilgrimage economy also birthed unexpected innovations. Inns began offering fixed-price menus to prevent disputes, an early form of consumer protection. Towns pooled resources to pave stretches of road, creating smoother paths that attracted even more traffic. Some communities developed primitive tourism boards, sending representatives to distant fairs to promote their local saints' miracles. The financial spillover reached far beyond the routes themselves. Flemish weavers ramped up production of sturdy wool cloaks favored by pilgrims, while Italian glassmakers crafted tiny vials for holy water that became must-have souvenirs. Even the food trade adapted. Bakeries along the Santiago perfected long-lasting bread that could survive weeks in a pilgrim's pack, while vineyards in Burgundy labeled certain barrels, knowing pilgrims would pay extra for wine blessed by association. This economic engine had a dark underside, though. As wealth concentrated in pilgrimage hubs, inequality sharpened like a knife. Peasants whose families had lived near a shrine for generations found themselves priced out by inns catering to deep-pocketed visitors. In The price of a loaf of bread tripled during peak season, forcing locals to beg for the scraps pilgrims left behind. Some communities rebelled. Records from 12th century Toulouse tell of farmers tearing down newly erected hostelries, furious that pilgrim traffic had trampled their crops. Others embraced more creative resistance. A band of disgruntled villagers in Navarre dug fake graves along the road, spreading rumors of bandits to scare travelers into taking a detour, one that conveniently passed through their own struggling market square. The most lasting impact, however, wasn't in coins or commodities, but in ideas. The constant flow of people made pilgrimage towns unlikely melting pots where innovations spread faster than anywhere else in medieval Europe. A new style of church architecture from Burgundy might appear in Spain within years, carried by returning pilgrims who'd admired it abroad. Medical knowledge leaped from monastery to monastery as traveling doctors shared cures. Even farming techniques improved as pilgrims observed different methods and brought seeds home in their packs. The roads became Europe's first internet, a network humming with information, where every traveler was both consumer and carrier of progress. By the late Middle Ages, this system had grown so entrenched that some towns faced crisis when pilgrimage trends shifted. A rumor about a rival shrine's more powerful relics could drain a local economy overnight. When the Black Death reduced pilgrim numbers to a trickle, entire industries collapsed like houses of cards. Yet the infrastructure remained, these hollowed out standing as silent witnesses to an era when faith moved not just souls, but markets. Today, walking through places like, or you can still trace the outlines of that vanished world. The widened streets built to accommodate crowds, the overgrown hospices where thousands once slept, the faint etchings of pilgrim graffiti on chapel walls. They're reminders that economics and devotion were never truly separate, just two currents in the same river, both shaping the medieval world in ways no one could have predicted. The Crusades transformed pilgrimage into something both familiar and terrifyingly new, a sacred journey armed with swords instead of staffs. For knights who took the cross, the road to Jerusalem wasn't just a path to absolution. It was a battlefield where every step was by bloodshed. These warriors saw little contradiction between piety and violence. To them, liberating the Holy Land from infidels was the ultimate act of devotion, a pilgrimage where the destination could only be earned through combat. Yet this fusion of faith and force created tensions that echoed across centuries. How did a tradition built on peaceable penance become entangled with holy war? The answer lies in the Church's genius for reframing old ideas. By declaring crusaders armed pilgrims, popes granted them the same spiritual rewards as those who walked to Santiago or Rome, indulgences that wiped away sins, protections for their families and lands. But the differences were stark. While traditional pilgrims traveled light, crusaders hauled siege engines. Where penitents sought solitude, soldiers marched in clamorous columns. And where a pilgrim might face bandits, crusaders clashed with entire armies. The sheer scale of violence unsettled even contemporaries. Saint Bernard of, who preached the Second Crusade, wrestled with this paradox, calling knights malefactors who could now draw profit from their crimes if directed against Islam. Yet for all their ferocity, crusaders clung to pilgrim rituals. They visited shrines en route, collecting relics as eagerly as loot. Many sewed crosses onto their tunics where pilgrim badges would normally hang, turning the symbol of their vow into a wearable testament. Some, like the English knight, Quincy, even insisted on walking barefoot during stretches of their campaign, mimicking the humility of penitential pilgrims. The irony was palpable. Men who slaughtered without remorse in one moment might kneel weeping before a saint's bones in the next. The impact on ordinary pilgrims was profound. As Crusader kingdoms took root in the Levant, routes to Jerusalem became militarized corridors. Travelers who once relied on local guides now moved under armed escort, their journeys timed to coincide with troop movements. Some shrines, like the Holy, became fortresses where pilgrims prayed surrounded by the clank of armor. The spiritual cost was steep. Peaceful pilgrims found themselves tarred with the same brush as their violent counterparts. Muslim rulers, understandably wary, began taxing or even imprisoning Christian travelers, blurring the line between devotee and invader. What's most revealing isn't how the Crusades borrowed pilgrimage's framework, but how they distorted it. Traditional pilgrims sought transformation through surrender to God's will, to the road's hardships. Crusaders sought transformation through domination, bending the Holy Land to their vision. The legacy of this collision lingers in the uneasy relationship between faith and force even today. Walk the paths of medieval pilgrims now, and you'll tread ground once marched by crusaders. Two versions of sacred journeying, one aimed at inner change, the other at reshaping the world. Both left footprints, but only one truly understood that the holiest battles are fought within. By the 16th century, the golden age of pilgrimage was fading like footsteps in the wind. What had once been a flood of travelers dwindled to a trickle, as forces both spiritual and political reshaped Europe's landscape. The Reformation struck first. Martin Luther's fiery sermons denounced pilgrimages as empty rituals, calling them roadside shows that distracted from true faith. Why walk 1,000 miles to touch a saint's bone, reformers asked, when God could be found in scripture or silent prayer? Protestant rulers seized on this critique, shuttering monasteries and dismantling shrines. In England, Henry VIII's agents melted down jeweled reliquaries, their treasures repurposed to fill royal coffers. Overnight, roads that had hummed with chant and footfall fell eerily quiet. Yet it wasn't just theology that emptied the paths. Wars turned pilgrimage routes into. The 100 Years' War left northern France's hostels in ruins, while the 30 Years' War made German forests too perilous for unarmed travelers. Even when peace flickered, banditry thrived in the chaos. Mercenaries turned, preying on the few devout souls still brave enough to journey. Cities that had prospered from pilgrim traffic withered. The once bustling market squares of, and echoed with the footsteps of stray dogs instead of singing processions. Ironically, the decline revealed just how deeply pilgrimage had shaped Europe. The roads themselves remained, worn so deep by centuries of footsteps that farmers plowing nearby fields still turned up pilgrim badges lost in the mud. Inns adapted, catering to merchants instead of penitents. The hospice where monks had once warmed frozen travelers, became a garrison for soldiers. Even the rituals lingered in disguised forms. Protestant travelers on the Grand Tour visited Rome not to venerate relics, but to sketch ruins and collect souvenirs, their secular curiosity, a distant cousin to medieval devotion. most enduring of all was the pilgrim's mindset, the idea that journeying could transform the self. Modern hikers tracing the Santiago today may not seek indulgences, but many still speak of the road's power to strip away pretenses, to forge connections across languages and cultures. The hostels that shelter them stand on foundations laid by medieval monks, their ethos of shared humanity unchanged. Even the scams persist. Only now, fake relics have been replaced by overpriced tour guides and counterfeit authentic local crafts. The roads didn't vanish. They simply evolved, carrying new kinds of seekers. Pilgrimage, in the end, was never just about reaching a shrine. It was about the cracks that form in us when we step beyond the familiar, the way the world seeps into those cracks and reshapes us. That truth outlasted Reformation edicts and crumbling hostels. It still calls, quiet but insistent, to anyone who's ever stood at a crossroads and felt the old pull of the horizon. The scallop shell markers of the Santiago still gleam on backpacks today, but the pilgrims who wear them carry burdens medieval travelers could never have imagined. Smartphones buzz with GPS maps where vellum guidebooks once crumbled, and hostels offer alongside simple meals. Yet for all the modern comforts, something primal remains. The blistered feet, the aching muscles, the quiet camaraderie of strangers walking toward the same horizon. Modern pilgrims might not fear bandits or plague, but they face their own trials. The temptation to quit when every muscle screams, the gnawing doubt that asks why they ever left their comfortable lives behind. The contrasts reveal themselves in unexpected ways. Where medieval pilgrims carried letters of safe passage, today's travelers flash pilgrim passports stamped at a bureaucratic echo of ancient credentials. The scallop shell, once proof of completing the journey, now dangles from high-tech hiking gear. Even the dangers have transformed. Instead of wolves, pilgrims fret over, rather than counterfeit relics. They navigate online scams selling fake, authentic experiences. Yet the essence persists. Just as medieval walkers gathered around fireplaces to share stories, modern pilgrims bond over communal dinners swapping tales in a dozen languages. The road still strips away pretenses, reducing bankers and baristas alike to equal footing, dusty, exhausted, and oddly exhilarated. What's most striking isn't the differences, but the echoes. Modern pilgrims still pause at the Iron Cross, leaving stones as symbolic burdens just as their ancestors did. The same Roman roads that guided medieval feet now lie beneath asphalt, their ancient grooves whispering through the pavement. And the questions that haunted travelers centuries ago, why am I here? What am I seeking still surface during solitary stretches through this endless wheat fields? The answers might vary: spiritual renewal, a break from burnout, the thrill of a physical challenge, but the hunger behind them is timeless. Some things, of course, are irrevocably changed. Medieval pilgrims walked toward a world where faith was the compass for everything. Today's travelers often navigate a more ambiguous landscape. The shrines still stand, but their pull is different, less about divine intervention, perhaps, than about touching something older and quieter than modern life. Yet in quiet moments, the past feels startlingly close. When dawn breaks over the Pyrenees, painting the trail in gold, or when the Cathedral of Santiago finally rises in the distance, the gasp of awe crosses centuries. Whether driven by faith, curiosity, or sheer stubbornness, those who walk these roads today join an unbroken chain of seekers. proof that some journeys refuse to fade, even when the world around them transforms beyond recognition. There's a quiet rebellion in the way medieval pilgrims traveled, a refusal to rush, an embrace of hardship that feels almost alien in our age of instant gratification. These travelers didn't just move from point A to point B. They let the journey reshape them, mile by painful mile. Think of the blisters that became calluses, the hunger that sharpened gratitude for a shared loaf of bread, the nights spent under stars that whispered how small they were in the grand scheme of things. Their perseverance wasn't just about reaching a destination. It was about surrendering to the transformative power of the road itself. In an era where we measure success in speed, same-day delivery, lightning-fast downloads, binge-watched series, their stories challenge us to ask, what do we lose when we refuse to let life scrape away at our edges? Faith, for these pilgrims, wasn't a static set of beliefs, but a living thing, tested by every storm and forged in every moment of doubt. Consider the German merchant who turned back 3 times before finally setting out for Jerusalem, his diary filled with scribbled prayers that grew steadier as the miles passed. Or the Spanish widow who walked with her husband's ashes in a pouch around her neck, her grief softening into something lighter with each shrine she visited. Their journeys reveal a truth we often forget. Conviction isn't the absence of uncertainty, but the decision to keep walking despite it. Today, when algorithms feed us content that confirms our biases and comfort is just a tap away, the Pilgrim's brand of faith, raw, messy, and hard-won, feels like a revelation. But perhaps the most startling lesson is how these travelers redefined hardship. Where we see obstacles to avoid, they saw opportunities to strip life down to its essentials. A broken sandal wasn't just a setback, it was a chance to accept help from a stranger. A wrong turn in the mountains didn't just mean delay. It led to an encounter with a hermit whose wisdom changed their course in ways they couldn't predict. Even suffering became a kind of alchemy. The knight who endured dysentery on the road to Rome later wrote that the illness burned away my pride like dross from gold. In our world of padded comforts and curated experiences, their willingness to lean into discomfort feels radical. What if we stopped treating challenges as inconveniences and started seeing them as the very things that make us fully human? The Pilgrims' greatest gift wasn't the relics they brought home, but the way their journeys blurred the line between sacred and mundane. A roadside spring wasn't just water, it was a reminder of baptism. A shared meal with strangers became communion. Even the act of walking, left foot, right foot, repeating until the mind emptied, turned into meditation long before the word entered our wellness vocabularies. There's a reason modern hikers on the speak of the providing, that uncanny sense that the road gives you exactly what you need, even if it's not what you wanted. The medieval pilgrims knew this secret intimately. When you surrender to the journey, ordinary moments crack open to reveal something extraordinary beneath. Their legacy isn't locked in the past. It's alive in anyone who's ever chosen the longer path, the harder truth, the quieter voice over the clamor of the crowd. It's there in the scientist who spends decades chasing a single question, the artist who revisits the same theme for years, the parent who shows up day after patient day. The Pilgrim's Road whispers that some things can't be hurried, not healing, not wisdom, not the slow unfurling of a life well lived. In a world obsessed with shortcuts, their footsteps remind us, The deepest rewards often lie not in the destination, but in the grit and grace it takes to get there. A leather shoe discovered in the mud of a long-forgotten riverbank tells a story no chronicle ever recorded. The precise curve of a pilgrim's foot, worn down by miles of travel, its sole patched twice with scraps of boar hide. This humble artifact, unearthed near the Swiss Alps, is one of countless treasures archaeologists are piecing together to rewrite our understanding of medieval pilgrimage. Unlike the grand tales of miracles and martyrs, these fragments speak of the unglamorous reality. Blisters treated with lard, coins sewn into hems for safekeeping, and the quiet desperation of those who walked until their bodies gave out. Take the pilgrim skeletons found in mass graves along the Via. Their bones bear witness to hardships no parchment could capture. Forensic analysis reveals stress fractures in ankles and knees, the telltale marks of relentless marching. Some show signs of healed arrow wounds, suggesting they survived bandit attacks only to succumb later to infection or exhaustion. Most haunting are the teeth, worn down from grinding coarse grain mixed with grit from poorly milled flour. These weren't just travelers. They were survivors of an endurance test we can scarcely fathom today. But it's not all suffering etched in bone and leather. Excavations at hostile sites have uncovered gaming pieces carved from animal bone, evidence of laughter and camaraderie among strangers sharing firelight. At Saint, archaeologists found a child's wooden toy horse near the remains of a pilgrim hospice, a poignant reminder that whole families sometimes undertook these journeys. Even the smallest finds carry weight. A thimble discovered near Canterbury suggests pilgrims mended their own clothes on the road, while charred seeds at campsites reveal they foraged wild berries to supplement meager rations. Coins tell their own tales of ingenuity and inequality. Hoards buried near dangerous mountain passes hint at pilgrims hiding savings before risky crossings. Some never return to reclaim them. The distribution of coin types maps unseen trade routes, like the Hungarian dinars found in French fields, proving pilgrims bartered across language barriers. Most revealing are the counterfeit coins mixed with real ones, their lead cores thinly coated in silver. These fakes, often dismissed as mere frauds, actually testify to a thriving informal economy where even the could participate, if only through deception. Perhaps the most startling discoveries come from underwater archaeology. Divers probing river crossings along the Santiago recovered pilgrim badges lost in fords, tiny lead scallop shells, and saintly portraits now green with patina. These weren't just souvenirs. They functioned as medieval QR codes, proving completion of the journey to suspicious innkeepers or toll collectors. Some badges show tooth marks, suggesting pilgrims tested their lead purity like anxious travelers, today biting gold coins. The true revelation of these finds isn't just about reconstructing the past, it's about dismantling myths. The polished narratives of devotional manuscripts gave us pilgrims who suffered nobly and triumphed piously. The dirt-stained artifacts give us humans, pragmatic, afraid, sometimes dishonest, but always pressing forward. A broken comb tangled with lice eggs speaks as eloquently about determination as any saint's legend. These pilgrims didn't just walk towards salvation. They carried their entire messy, magnificent humanity with them, leaving traces we're only now learning to read. What emerges is a portrait of pilgrimage as the great equalizer. The skeleton of a noblewoman buried near Burgos shows the same spinal deformities as a peasant's remains outside Toulouse, proof that wealth might buy a horse, but not immunity from the road's toll. A gold ring found in a pauper's grave near, its inside engraved, "For my love at home," reminds us that behind every artifact was a person tethered to others by invisible threads of memory and longing. These discoveries do more than illuminate history, they bridge centuries. When a modern hiker on the finds a scallop shell marker, they're touching the same symbol pilgrims clutched 800 years ago. The difference is we now know what that symbol cost, not just in coin or miles, but in the quiet, grinding persistence of ordinary people who believed something extraordinary lay beyond the horizon. Archaeology hasn't demystified the pilgrim's journey. It's made their faith more astonishing by revealing just how much they endured to honor it. The medieval pilgrim strides across our screens in endless variations, sometimes as a solemn figure in a sweeping historical epic, other times as a comic relief character stumbling through mud in a fantasy game. Think of the grizzled wanderer in the Canterbury Tales adaptations, his robes tattered but his eyes alight with quiet wisdom. Or the armored knights of Assassin's Creed, their pilgrim disguises mere covers for stealthy assassinations. These portrayals capture fragments of truth: the hardship, the symbolism of the staff and scallop shell, the mingling of diverse travelers on shared paths. Yet they often miss the raw, unvarnished reality: the stench of unwashed bodies in crowded hostels, the terror of hearing wolves howl just beyond the firelight, the quiet desperation of those who walked not for glory, but because they had nowhere else to go. Video games, in particular, have latched onto pilgrimage as a narrative device, though they tend to emphasize adventure over authenticity. In A Plague Tale, Innocence, two siblings flee across plague-ridden France, their journey mirroring the perilous treks of medieval penitents. The game nails the atmosphere, the looming threat of disease, the way faith and survival collide, but it glosses over the mundane struggles: the blisters, the hunger, the sheer monotony of putting one foot in front of the other for months on end. Meanwhile, The Witcher 3 features pilgrims as background flavor, their chanting processions adding to war-torn landscapes. Yet these figures rarely grapple with the moral complexities real pilgrims faced, like the knight who traded his sword for a staff after a lifetime of violence, or the thief who walked to atone for sins no one knew he'd committed. Films often romanticize pilgrimage into a picturesque quest. The Way, starring Martin Sheen, transplants the Santiago to modern times, but preserves the mythic glow: sun-dappled trails, heartwarming encounters, a tidy emotional resolution. Real medieval pilgrims, though, rarely found such neat arcs. Their diaries speak of unanswered prayers, of shrines that left them cold, of moments when the divine felt painfully absent. Even Python and the Holy Grail, for all its absurdity, touches on a deeper truth: the Church's exploitation of pilgrimage. The scene with monks chanting Pi Jesu while thwacking themselves with boards. It's satire, but it echoes real critiques of an institution that sometimes prioritized profit over piety. Why does this imagery still grip us? Perhaps because pilgrimage distills the human experience into its form, a journey with purpose, where every step is both physical and metaphysical. Modern stories borrow the Pilgrim's shell not just for its antique charm, but for what it represents: transformation through struggle. The Star Wars universe has its own pilgrim in Jedi Wanderers like, whose solitary travels mirror the medieval quest for enlightenment. Even the Lord of the Rings frames Trek to Mount Doom as a dark pilgrimage, where the hero's burden is both literal and spiritual. These narratives resonate because they tap into something primal, the idea that meaning isn't found in comfort, but in the crucible of the road. Yet the most compelling modern reinterpretations aren't those that replicate the past, but those that reimagine its essence. The video game Journey strips pilgrimage down to its emotional core. No dialogue, no maps, just a lone figure moving through a desert toward a distant mountain. It captures what medieval chronicles often omit: the wordless awe of stepping into a cathedral's shadow after months of travel, the way solitude can hollow you out and fill you up in the same breath. Similarly, the novel The Unlikely Pilgrimage of Harold Fry modernizes the quest, replacing relics with redemption, but keeps the raw vulnerability that made medieval pilgrimage so powerful. What these portrayals sometimes miss, though, is the collective heartbeat of the experience. Medieval pilgrims rarely walked alone. They formed temporary families on the road, sharing food, fears, and folk tales. A Flemish weaver might bond with an Italian merchant over a campfire, their languages different but their blisters identical. Modern stories focus on individual heroes, but the truth was messier, richer, a tapestry of shared humanity woven from hardship. That's the paradox pilgrimage offers us today. It's both a mirror and a window. It reflects our own yearning for purpose, while letting us glimpse a world where faith moved feet, not just hearts. And perhaps that's why it endures, not as a relic, but as a reminder that the most profound journeys are those that change us long after the road ends. The call of the Pilgrim's Road taps into something ancient and universal, a longing to strip away life's distractions and confront the raw edges of our own existence. Psychologists studying modern pilgrims on routes like the Santiago have uncovered striking parallels with their medieval counterparts. Both groups describe a shared compulsion: the need to step outside ordinary life, to trade comfort for clarity, and to face challenges that reveal hidden reserves of strength. This isn't just travel, it's deliberate dislocation, a voluntary uprooting from the familiar to force a reckoning with the self. The medieval pilgrim who slept in ditches and the modern hiker nursing blisters in a hostel bunk are united by the same realization: that suffering, when chosen, can become a kind of alchemy, turning base routines into golden moments of awareness. At the heart of this transformation lies what researchers call liminality, the threshold state where old identities dissolve and new ones can emerge. Pilgrimage routes functioned as literal and psychological borderlands, where a farmer could shed the weight of feudal obligations and simply become a seeker. Modern studies of long-distance hikers reveal identical patterns: the trail names they adopt, the way they describe feeling between lives as they walk. The medieval practice of taking a pilgrim's vow at the start of the journey created this liminal space intentionally, declaring the traveler temporarily exempt from societal roles. Today's pilgrims experience it organically, finding that somewhere around the 100th mile, their job titles and social status stop mattering, leaving only the elemental question: who am I when no one is watching? The grueling physicality of pilgrimage plays a surprising role in this mental shift. Neurologists note that prolonged walking induces a meditative state, rhythmic footfalls syncing with breath, the mind emptying of clutter. Medieval pilgrims, lacking our vocabulary for mindfulness, called it the prayer of the feet. This bodily exhaustion lowers psychological defenses, making way for profound introspection. Accounts from the 12th century describe hardened soldiers breaking down in tears at shrines, their armor no match for the vulnerability forced upon them by months of travel. Contemporary pilgrims report identical breakthroughs, often at the same mountain passes or river crossings where their ancestors faltered. The body's exhaustion, it seems, becomes a gateway to emotional release. But pilgrimage also answers a deeper hunger, the human need for narrative coherence. Life's random hardships gain meaning when reframed as trials on a sacred journey. A medieval peasant suffering famine might reinterpret their hunger as purification before reaching a shrine. A modern pilgrim battling rainstorms sees them as tests of resolve. Psychologists call this benefit finding, and it's why pilgrimage thrives even in secular forms, whether hiking the Appalachian Trail or walking the length of Japan's Shikoku temples. The road provides a story structure where suffering isn't pointless, but purposeful. Perhaps most fascinating is how pilgrimage leverages what behavioral scientists term the fresh start effect. Setting out on a journey, especially at symbolic points like a new year or after personal loss, triggers our brains to categorize past failures as belonging to the old self. Medieval pilgrims literally shed their old clothes at certain shrines, donning fresh garments to mark rebirth. Today's travelers experience similar mental resets, journals from the brim with phrases like, "I left my old life at the Pyrenees." The physical act of moving forward becomes a metaphor for psychological progress, each step a tiny defiance against stagnation. This transformative power wasn't reserved for saints or ascetics. The graffiti scrawled on medieval hostel walls, crude drawings, prayers, boasts, reveals ordinary people grappling with extraordinary inner shifts. A charcoal sketch of a ship beside the words, "Was here," might be all that remains of a sailor seeking redemption after a drowned crew. Modern pilgrims continue this tradition, leaving notes in refuge guest books that echo the same messy mix of hope and doubt. The universality of these impulses suggests pilgrimage isn't just a historical curiosity, but a timeless response to the human condition, a way to walk our way back to ourselves when the world grows too loud or life too heavy. The road, it seems, has always been less about the destination than about who we become along the way. A holographic scallop shell glows on your living room floor as a headset transports you to the stone arches of Santiago's cathedral. No blisters, no bedbugs, just the sublime architecture at the click of a button. Virtual reality now offers meticulously crafted pilgrimages, from Jerusalem's Church of the Holy to the misty trails of, all without leaving your couch. Apps gamify the journey, rewarding daily steps with digital relics, while online communities simulate the camaraderie of medieval hostels through Discord chats and Zoom prayer circles. At first glance, it's a revelation. Accessibility for the homebound, sustainability for the planet, even safety for those who'd face persecution on physical journeys. But peel back the pixels, and questions emerge. Can a bloodstream flooded with adrenaline from real-life bandit encounters be replicated by VR's sanitized dangers? Does skipping the ache of a 1,000-mile walk mean skipping the humility that ache cultivates? Already, tech-savvy monasteries are experimenting with hybrid models. The Benedictines of Montserrat stream dawn vigils for remote participants, while AI chatbots generate personalized medieval pilgrim diaries based on your travel preferences. GPS-enabled staffs vibrate when modern walkers pass historic sites, overlaying augmented reality visions of 12th century onto barren fields. These innovations solve practical hurdles, cost, mobility, time, but risk reducing pilgrimage to a checklist of consumable experiences. The medieval road forced surrender to its rhythms, detours around landslides, nights stranded by storms, the agony of slow healing. Digital journeys, by contrast, thrive on convenience. Pause your when work calls, rewind a missed sunset at mute annoying fellow travelers with a toggle. Yet it's precisely the uncontrollable, uncomfortable moments that pilgrims across centuries cite as transformative. As one modern walker quipped after a VR trial, "You can't +Alt+ delete a spiritual crisis." The rise of digital pilgrim communities reveals another paradox. Facebook groups meticulously recreate the social fabric of medieval routes, with members sharing real-time tips on vacancies or blister remedies. Twitch streams of live pilgrimages garner thousands of virtual companions, cheering walkers toward Santiago. But these connections lack the raw vulnerability of confessional conversations under starry skies, where anonymity and exhaustion dissolved facades. There's no algorithm to replicate the trust built when a stranger bandages your feet or shares their last orange on a scorching afternoon. Digital platforms excel at information exchange, yet struggle to foster the unscripted grace notes. The elderly villager who presses a wrinkled postcard into your hand, the sudden silence of a forest where the only sound is your own ragged breath. Perhaps the most radical disruption lies in redefining what makes a journey sacred. For Gen Z pilgrims documenting on TIC, the act of filming sunrise reflections or crafting viral trail transformations videos becomes its own devotional practice. Online, micro-pilgrimages invite participants to undertake symbolic walks in their neighborhoods while listening to curated playlists of medieval chant. These adaptations aren't inauthentic. They echo how medieval pilgrims repurposed pagan footpaths into Christian routes. The danger isn't innovation, but dilution. When every mindful stroll through a park gets branded as pilgrimage, does the term retain its power? Medieval travelers earned their scallop shells through blood and sacrifice. If hardship becomes optional, does transcendence follow? Yet buried in these debates glimmers an unexpected continuity. Whether clutching a smartphone or a parchment map, pilgrims still seek the same fundamental things: meaning beyond daily routines, connection across divides, proof that their struggles matter. The road, real or virtual, remains a mirror. As one VR developer admitted after walking the physical, no simulation can make you confront why you're running from your own life for 30 days straight. Technology may change the how, but the human heart still whispers the why. The future of pilgrimage won't be about replacement, but resonance, finding new ways to answer that ancient call when the stars go dark behind a screen's glow, and the only step left is the one you choose to take. The epic journeys of medieval pilgrims were never just about reaching a destination. They were about the slow, painful alchemy that happens when ordinary people step beyond the boundaries of safety and let the road remake them. Think of the merchant who traded his ledger for a pilgrim's staff after losing his family to plague, or the young mother who walked to Santiago with her infant strapped to her chest, her feet bleeding but her voice steady as she sang lullabies under foreign stars. These travelers didn't just brave bandits and blizzards. They carried the weight of their own humanity across mountains and rivers, trusting that the act of moving forward would somehow lighten the load. Their legacy isn't confined to history books or crumbling parchments. Walk the Santiago today, and you'll see it in the way strangers share food at communal tables, or how a simple arrow scratched into stone can feel like a lifeline when you're lost. Modern travelers might carry GPS instead of lead pilgrim badges, but the essence remains: a longing to strip away life's noise and confront what's left when comfort falls away. The medieval pilgrim's greatest lesson wasn't about piety, it was about resilience. They understood that real transformation doesn't happen in cathedrals alone, but in the thousand small surrenders along the way, the blisters that teach patience, the wrong turns that reveal unexpected vistas, the moments when you have no choice but to trust a stranger's outstretched hand. What makes their stories so enduring isn't the danger or the drama, but the quiet revelation that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep walking despite it. When a 14th century widow named of Assisi set out for Jerusalem at 60 years old, her neighbors called it madness. Yet her diary, preserved in a Florentine archive, captures something timeless. The road peeled me like an onion, layer after layer, until only the core remained, the part that knew how to hope. That's the gift these pilgrims left us. Not just routes on a map, but proof that the hardest journeys often lead not to a place, but to a different version of ourselves. So as we retrace their steps, whether literally or through the pages of history, we're left with more than admiration. We're faced with an invitation to ask what we'd risk for what matters most. The medieval world had its scallop shells and shrines. Ours has its own callings, creative projects that demand years of unseen labor, activism that requires standing alone, personal transformations with no guaranteed outcome. The terrain has changed, but the question remains the same. When the path grows steep and the reasons for turning back pile up, what keeps us moving forward? Maybe it's the same force that guided a dusty traveler 7 centuries ago. The stubborn, luminous belief that somewhere beyond the horizon, whether in this world or the next, the journey will prove worth the